Welcome to the Happy Mindset, where we use the power of language and storytelling to help you find your voice. Today's episode is episode number 42, and today's episode title is Humans 2.0. Today I'm joined by Metry. Mark is a podcast host of Humans 2.0, where he interviews people from around the world in order to help his listeners to upgrade their lives and become the best version of themselves. Guests on the show have included people like Seth, Godin, Sears, and he's soon to interview Tom Bilyeu. So he talks to high quality people and people who have a lot of knowledge to share with the world. Mark himself is also an interesting guy. He's been featured in Forbes. He is, as a teenager, he earned hundreds of thousands of dollars when he created a Minecraft server. So today we're going to talk about his evolution so far, what he's learned when it comes to his mindset, his brain, his mind, who he is. We're also going to talk a little bit about technology and the future of technology. Mark is the founder of a company called VuDream, where he explains augmented reality and virtual reality in simple, everyday, common language. So today's interview is very interesting. I hope you enjoy it. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and a review so other people can find the podcast. And if you enjoyed Happy Mindset in general, head on over to Facebook, join the group there, and interact in the community over there. So thanks again for listening, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Okay, so thanks for joining us today, Mark.
Dennis, thanks for having me, man.
You're welcome. My pleasure. So I just want to start off with your podcast. So Humans 2.0. What is Humans 2.0 all about?
Yeah, so I got the idea for my podcast in the middle of 2017. It was kind of at a time in my life where 2015, I sort of fell down a rough spot and sort of started to shift my consciousness. And by 2016, I had sort of began the process of reinventing myself for the first time. And, for anyone that does that, it's a very rewarding journey, but it's also very difficult. And so, I was hitting a lot of different forms of resistance from, myself, from the world around me, from my business. And, one of the ways that I've learned to get help really is to have a direct conversation with somebody that is walking the walk, somebody that is not a theorist, somebody that is actually doing it successfully in the world, has been doing it for a while, are able to help other people do it. And so I just figured, what's the best mechanism for me to create this almost like this education program for me, and then at the same time, help me out in other areas of my life. So for me, the podcast was really just about learning from the best of the best, people that are billionaire philanthropists to, some of the most well-known authors and business leaders of our time to, people that are Pulitzer Prize winning journalists, people that are, maybe even political activists, people that are doing crazy things in technology, just anything that I am sort of interested in. Humans 2.0 became the vehicle in which I began to do that in the world.
Okay, so it started from your own process of self-discovery and understanding the world better? Is that where it came from?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. And so, you've got a lot of high-quality guests on your podcast. So how did you, somebody who's so young, how did you go about imagining that was possible for you on your podcast, starting out? Or was that even something that was there at the very beginning?
Yeah, I think there was a small part of it that was there from the very beginning, but what I really started to do is, obviously when I started the podcast, I didn't really have much of an image for it. To be honest with you, I didn't even know what the podcast was going to be about. Mm-hmm. I was just like, hey, I'm going to try doing this thing and see what happens. But what ended up happening is, while I was doing the podcast, I told you I got the idea for it in the middle of 2017. I finally ended up pulling the trigger on it towards the end of August. And, from August until the end of that year, 2017, I didn't really take it seriously. And, I think I had 10 episodes out or something like that. And it was, towards the end of 2017, I started to reflect. What was going on, what was happening. And, at that time, nobody really listened to my podcast. So it wasn't like anything about the audience or the listeners.
Mhm.
But what I came to the conclusion to is, nobody else is taking this whole podcasting thing seriously. And the people that did take it seriously, people like, Gary Vaynerchuk, Tim Ferriss, Lewis Howes, those are the people that are winning. And so I just started to look at the market. I started to look at, okay, there are people that have podcasts that are either a part of businesses or just sort of like individual personal brands that are sort of just like not taking it seriously. And when I understood that, I really began to see kind of like the opportunity that was available for me.
Mhm.
And, when I started thinking in terms of that perspective, I started thinking like, hey, Mark, you are not, I was having this conversation with myself and I was like, hey, Mark, you are not Tim Ferriss. You are not Gary Vaynerchuk. You are not Lewis Howes. And I started to think, how can I become these people, right? And there's a lot of different factors of it, obviously. But in my opinion, one of the biggest factors is consistency and showing up again and again and again and again and again, right? And so when I took a look at the industry and I saw that most podcasts were uploading once a week or once every other week, I realized there was a major opportunity for me. So once I understood that, I kind of put my high beams on and I just went full force, putting out podcast episode one after the other. And the reason why I answer your question in that way is, I knew there was a lot of work ahead of me, in order to be interviewing the people that, I'm interviewing today, right? Like the reason why these things are happening, is not by accident. I put one foot in front of the other every single day. And then eventually, once you have like 130 episodes and, you're authentic, you're a kind person, eventually when you reach out to these people, they can see themselves through you and, sometimes they'll say yes. And so that's how I've really gotten like the biggest guests that I've had on, just by putting in the work and by being consistent and by being authentic and true to my values. And, my kind of philosophy on this is, for every 99 or even for every 999 people that say no, one person will say yes. And so I think it's just sort of a numbers game and consistency in the long-term strategy.
When did you start learning about consistency, and did you always have that philosophy of you might be turned down 999 times, but at one time somebody will say yes?
It's an interesting question. I think it really came from, this is going to be interesting. So I honestly think that, like when I look back in my life, I, was not necessarily, a good school student, right? I largely kind of ignored school for the most part. And I wouldn't necessarily classify myself as a persistent hard worker either. But I honestly think that I learned consistency from playing video games. And what I mean by that is this, if you're playing like a Mario game or something, and, you are going through this level and you keep going through the level, and then you get to this point where, the level becomes difficult or there's some kind of like a boss fight. And you keep losing again and again and again and again and again and again until eventually, you just keep pressing the buttons and then eventually something happens. So I'd say one part is that. And I'd say the other part is, when I was first going through my journey, I quickly realized the importance of, being 0 or 100. And what I mean by that is like, I don't think that you can break down life into these small little boxes. I think that you need, and the average person, if they really want to be great, to be great regardless of the circumstances, to be great regardless of the environment, regardless of what they're doing. It is the essence of their character. And so when you're talking about that, consistency is really the name of the game. And I think once you do become consistent and you show up even when you don't feel like it, or even when you're not motivated to do so, you really start to build discipline. And the more you can show up on days like that, the more you have a higher likelihood of gaining success. And the more success that you gain, for most people, begins to reinforce the discipline and the consistency that you take every day. And so to me, I just kind of look at it as, the operating system of life.
So was there a time where you would have given into your feelings? Because a lot of times it's hard for people to form habits and consistency because we take our feelings seriously, and if we don't feel like doing it, we won't do it sometimes. Were you ever like that, where you were kind of more led by your feelings and that type of thing?
Yeah, I mean, that's how I would classify the first, 18 years of my life. But, it still happens today, right? Like there are, still times where, I have feelings of anxiety or hopelessness. And, sometimes, you, depending on the individual, sometimes you just can't really do much. Sometimes you have to, just tell yourself like, hey, I'm just going to take a break, or I'm just going to go to sleep and I'm going to try this again tomorrow. Right. But honestly, it's really about just like that 100% or zero, because if you are 100% in it, and you're constantly taking action and building momentum, you have a much less likelihood of slipping. But if you're doing something like 50% of the time and then 50% of the time, you have a much, much, much bigger likelihood of kind of slipping into, those old patterns, right? And if you just sort of look at, biology, evolutionary biology, you'd see that the average human has something, nobody really knows the number, but it's something like 50,000 to 70,000 thoughts a day. And it's like, some of those thoughts are going to be crazy. Some of those thoughts are going to, are going to be things that you would never think out loud. Some of those thoughts are going to be, very scary, hopeless thoughts. And it's just like all about understanding that that is totally okay, because that's complete human nature. And then to build your environment and to build in habits and rituals that enable you to be more of yourself and less prone to sort of this evolutionary meat sack that we are all born in.
Yeah, that makes sense. The environment, so starting off, say if somebody's in an environment where they're not too comfortable yet, how do they go about shaping that environment to what they want in their life?
Great question, man. So when I first started, I was not in the right environment, right? The people that I had around me were not the people that I should have had in my life, were not supportive towards my dreams, towards my goals, or anything else that I wanted to do. And so what I ended up doing is, really what I started to do is I didn't have anybody around me that could teach me, that could mentor me, that could show me the path. And so what I did was I just started to listen to podcasts. There was a time in my life where, I don't know how to word this, but I almost want to say sort of, waking up. And, that's, for me, it was very scary. And so one of the things that I did, what I learned that wouldn't keep me depressed or anxious and kind of like the rock bottom of my life, was getting out of my room, getting out of my apartment, and literally just walking around listening to podcasts of people like Tim Ferriss and of Lewis Howes. And it's like, that's not the perfect scenario. Like, you want to have real people in your life that care for you and whatnot. But it's like, you've really got to do, and you've got to start with whatever it is you have. You can't wait for the environment to get perfect. You yourself have to start working at it. And, I want to be really clear here. When I say environment, I'm not just talking about the people around you, the location that you live in. I'm talking about like your your psychological environment. What are the words that you're saying to yourself? What kind of environment do you have in your body? How are you moving? What are you eating throughout the day? How often are you sleeping? And it's like, when you take a look at that, you find a lot more factors that you can actually control. And so for me, I just started off with what I could. I started walking around because that's what I found out to be one of the ways where I wouldn't be so anxious or depressed. And then I'd just keep my earbuds in and just listen to some of the smartest, most intelligent people in the world. And eventually, once you do that, you start to get little snippets. And I think if you are desperate enough or have the desire enough, you eventually start to take action on like this little thing here and then this little thing there. Like, I know for me, some of like the big strides when I look back now that really changed my life were, like I used to be over 200 pounds, and that's how I actually got into this whole, self-development stuff. Like, I didn't know what the words mindset or psychology or consciousness were, or any of that stuff. And how I actually got into it was, I gained a bunch of weight. And I eventually just like looked at the mirror one day and I said like, wait, what's going on here? And it was through that physical notification of my body that I was able to start asking questions. I was able to be more curious and be like, wait, what's going on here? And that's when I started to, Google and learn and put in the research of, what does it actually take to lose weight, right? Because that's the only thing that I knew at that time. That's how at first my environment started to shift. And, through eating healthy and exercising, then I was able to actually, sleep well for the first time in my life. And it's like, once I started to do those things and change my environment, I had the energy to pick up new habits. So then I started to do mindfulness meditation. And then I started to journal things down, like trying to, rewire my brain with trying to think of things to be grateful for right when I wake up in the morning and at night. And eventually, when you start doing those things, it starts to change your internal environment. And then once you change your internal environment, then you're able to change your external environment. So, my life is completely different from what it was 2.5 years ago. And that's because I got my internal environment good, and I was able to translate that into my external environment. And so, it takes a long time, but it's definitely possible.
Interesting. Because even back then, though, you were successful in certain areas. Because you, quite young as a teenager, you had great success with Minecraft, and you were very successful in one area, but in other areas, I guess you weren't there. What did you learn from that time as well about, like, because you made a lot of money at that time as well. What did you learn from that experience? What was the key lesson?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, Dennis. So, so when I was about 15 years old, I love playing video games. Video games is like sort of my main thing, right? And when I was 15, I ended up stumbling into this game called Minecraft. And to keep a long story short, I basically ended up creating the #1 Minecraft multiplayer server in the world, which made me, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And, real quick, like, my background is, my parents were immigrants. They came to America with barely any money. We grew up on food stamps, government housing. So we really didn't have much money at all. And I sort of went from that to all of a sudden, being self-made, very financially successful. And, at that time, I didn't even get it. I didn't even comprehend it at that time. It didn't hit me at all. But the one thing that ended up happening, Dennis, is, so I was in high school at that time. I was 15. And, when you come from sort of like this immigrant background. And, you know, you kind of see the American dream story narrative. And then you see people on TV and on the internet, like people in Silicon Valley, starting from nothing and making a bunch of money. And then now they're finally happy and successful. And that was sort of like the narrative that was running in my mind. And then, you know, when I made that money, the hundreds of thousands of dollars, you know, I basically had, you know, almost unlimited freedom. You know, obviously, depending on who you ask, that's not too much money, and depending especially where you live. But, you know, for somebody like me that is not motivated by money, that's like having all the money in the world, right? And I had, you know, a bunch of friends around me that, you know, were like, hey, you know, I can't wait to graduate high school and then to go to college and then to graduate college, to get a job and then eventually get like a 6-figure job salary. And it's like, I was already at that point when I was 15 years old. And so what ended up actually happening is I sort of had like this cognitive dissonance of the path that I was on versus the path that I actually wanted to take. Because what I realized was, you know, I had reached my definition of success, but I still thought of myself as a loser. I was still unhappy despite having that money. And so I think because I had that level of monetary success, I was eventually able to, it's not like this is a good thing, but I was eventually able to kind of like, you know, spiral down into like this depressed version of myself at rock bottom. And then eventually, you know, today be truly successful in every sense. Because it's like this, right? Like, I don't think that, of course there are exceptions, but, you know, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I don't know if you've seen that before, but basically kind of like the primitive version of it is, you know, for any human to sort of think higher, they need to achieve a, you know, belonging, or excuse me, they need to achieve, you know, a sense of security, and they need to have food, they need to have water, they need to just kind of have like the bare survival resources. And then, you know, you work your way up, then you can start forming relationships and like that. So I think that through me making the money, you know, I was able to sort of, in a way, kind of climb up to that ladder, to be able to think of the things that I was thinking of, because I wasn't necessarily worried about money. But honestly, for me, it was just such a surprising time in my life. Like, I got very, very lucky for sure.
That's interesting. I guess, yeah, that makes sense, because your thinking wouldn't have been bogged down in the survival needs with the money, so you might have been at a higher level to think about other stuff. That's actually quite interesting, yeah. So how about like the questions, looking back in hindsight through your journey so far, how important have been the questions you've been asking yourself?
Yeah, so I mean, so I remember, sorry about that. I'm just, it's on my phone. So I sort of remember, like, at the start of my journey, you know, when I was, excuse me, one second. Excuse me. So when I was sort of at rock bottom in my life, and when I was sort of coming out of it, I remember asking myself this question that, you know, really ended up shifting my perspective. And it was this, you know, who is Mark Metry? Who am I? And the reason why I say that is this. I had a fixed image of who Mark Metry was. I had this identity, this character that I had built up in my head that worked off a perception of other people. And the moment when I asked myself, you know, who is Mark Metry? Who am I? That gave me the mental freedom to venture past that current definition of who Mark Metry was. And I realized that a big reason why I was struggling, was because I was trying to hold on to the past. I was trying to hold on to this version, this identity of myself. And through that, you kind of understand my podcast. Human version 2.0, I was human version 1.0, right? And it's like, that was a major question for me. And, I would say probably another question that I remember, asking myself, there's so many different questions, right? But I remember another question I wanted to ask myself after I got over that first one of who am I? And I started to sort of build this new image is, who do I want to become? And the reason why that's important is once you figure out who you want to become in whatever capacity, right? You don't necessarily, depending on which area in your life, what stage you're at in your life, you don't necessarily have to have like a plan. You don't necessarily have to be super specific. But what happens is once you can, write this stuff down or at least start to imagine it for the first time in your life, you then lead into the next question, which is, who do I need to become? And then it's, if that's the person who I want to become, what do I need to do today to get to that person in 5 years? And from that methodology, that is really in which really like the steps that I started to take to really transform my life, right? Like we all have different goals. We all have different ambitions in life. And I think it's a matter of looking at those, breaking them down into, small action steps, and then just doing those every single day consistently without stop.
And so when it comes to your thoughts and your thinking, have you used things like meditation, mindfulness, or different stuff to give you that space between the thoughts which are telling you who they think are? The thing is, without the space between your thoughts and who you are, it's very easy to get wrapped up in that identity, like you're saying, they're a very fixed identity. So how did you keep that momentum going where you kept the space between the thoughts?
Man, I love that question. Yeah. So I went through that dark spot in my life towards the end of 2015, beginning of 2016. I ended up changing my nutrition and diet, sleep, exercise. In about the middle of 2016, in about September, October. And through doing that, I ended up picking up mindfulness meditation in November. And, I've been doing it every single day since then, with a couple exceptions. But really, like, I consider meditation to be, sort of like the first day of the rest of my life. When I look back at it now, that's where sort of, one of the line in the sand moments, so to speak. And the reason is, man, the first day I meditated, like I remember it like it was yesterday. It was on Halloween day of 2016. I was on a bus. I was going on a trip with some of my friends. And I was just like, hey, I've been looking at this meditation stuff. And I was on the app store on my phone. I saw the Headspace app. And I said, I got 45 minutes to kill here on this bus. I might as well download this app and meditate for like 10 minutes, right? So I do that and I do it. And, I wake up and, after the meditation and, things just seem different. I don't necessarily can't put my tongue on it or tell you exactly what happened, but throughout the rest of that day, it just felt like a different experience. Like it started, like it almost felt like I was wearing a new pair of glasses. And I want to say like 2 weeks of me meditating, it was very uncomfortable. And I would actually say that life for me, perceptually speaking, actually began to get worse. It became harder. And that's because I started to become conscious of a lot of the things that I was trying to hide about myself, to myself. And kind of like what you just said, the best analogy that I can kind of explain this to somebody is, human beings are like onions. Onions have many layers. We have an outer layer, an external layer that, is what we show to the world, right? It is the layer that we try to project onto the world. But, we are actually much more complex. And we've got sort of like this center bulb of who we really are. That is often sort of like this very soft, sensitive, mushy, authentic version of ourselves. And what ended up happening is, as I started to meditate, those layers began to dissolve day by day. And eventually it got me to that point where, I remember, like it was yesterday, it was November 13th of 2016, where, I sort of had like this life-changing revelation in my life where I understood that in order to do anything in life, one must take 100% individual responsibility. And once you do that, that is where you begin to find your power. And so through that process of me, first eating well, sleeping, exercising, then that's when the door to meditation unfolded. And that for me was probably the most, pivotal habit. And I would honestly say that meditation is the number one thing that I recommend to people, aside from eating healthy, as a top priority in life.
Yeah. So on your podcast, what's the common lesson you see people learn? You have a lot of different people on your podcast, a lot of successful people. What's the common thing that keeps cropping up time and time again about a lesson that somebody has learned to get them to the next level in their journey?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that in life, most times, not every time, somebody achieves a level of external success once they have reached an internal state of success. Sometimes it happens vice versa. And oftentimes, even the people that are externally successful, even some, multimillionaires and billionaires out there, are still actually miserable with their lives. But through interviewing my podcast, there's so many different stories. There are some commonalities, but, a lot of people are different, right? And so I would honestly say the one commonality is they work their face off. They work harder than everyone else around them. I mean, that is really it, right? And I think some people listening might hear that and might disregard that, or they might say like, oh, you shouldn't work too hard, or if you got to have a good work-life balance. But it's like, no, you're misunderstanding my point. And it's this: when I say they work their face off, I'm not talking about their 9-to-5 job, even though it very well might be. I'm talking about they are living life from the inside out. And in every single moment, they are working their face off towards that ideal life that they have in their mind. Honestly, I think that is the one commonality that I've seen. And it's like, we all have different areas to work on. Yeah, go ahead.
So it's the inner work more so than anything you're talking about there that are doing consistently every day.
I mean, I think it's everything, right? Because I don't think you can do inner work without doing external work, right? Like I think it's sort of a symbiotic relationship. I think you at times you do need to work, if this is your goal, your ambition, to, I don't know, work 80, 100-hour weeks. I don't know. Everyone is different. Everyone's got different goals. But what I'm saying is, whatever sort of definition of success that you have in your mind, you have just got to put in the work in every single moment. I talked about this on like social media, and I got a lot of hate for it. And what I'm saying is this: my definition of working your face off is prioritizing, 7.5 to 8 hours of sleep every day. My definition of working my face off is me waking up every single morning and going to the gym, doing some kind of exercising, and, not putting, not eating unhealthy foods in my body. Me working my face off is me telling myself and having a conversation with myself every morning of saying, hey, Mark, I hope you're doing well. you have got to show up as Mark Metry 2.0. You have got to show up as your true, authentic self today, even when you don't feel like. My definition of working my face off is, spending time unconditionally and immersively with my family at certain times when, that calls for. Me working my face off is, me when I'm not spending time doing things like this or other things in my own individual life. It's me working on my business and helping other people's dreams become a reality. And so I really just think it matters on the individual, but the one commonality that I've had on all my guests is they will outwork every single person around them based on their own definition.
I'm glad you defined that. I think a big problem I see is that people jump the gun on when they hear certain words, the language they use, and they don't take the time to understand what you actually mean by working your face off there. So that was,
absolutely. One thing I can say is like this. A lot of people will hear that even with the full explanation that I said at the end, and they'll say, no. Like, the reason why that person is this way is because, they'll just make up an excuse, right? They'll say, oh, he got lucky, or, he happened to be born here, or his dad, gave him this. And it's just like, as soon as you can understand and realize that that is BS, loser, excuse talk, the more you get on to actually figuring out and doing what it actually takes to be at the top of any field, if that's what you want in life. Not everyone wants that, right? And I think, every person has sort of like their own definition of success. And I think, you don't really understand the definition of success until you have put in enough internal and external work to sort of gain context and perspective around your life.
So there's another aspect to your life too, where VR and AR, that's technology is a big component of your life as well. How did you get involved in VR and AR, and what are you doing with your company, VuDream? I think that's the...
Yeah. So I started VuDream towards the end of 2016, and I actually ended up starting it sort of to, come out of my rock bottom in a way. For me, it was sort of like starting a conquest to create something bigger than myself. My business came before my podcast, and, I was just always as a kid, like really, really just interested in technology. I learned how to code and make websites when I was like 11, 12, and I started to understand the power, the unconceivable power of exponential technologies that almost nobody today understands, and sort of just kind of, writes them off or says some kind of thing like, oh, social media is bad, or technology is destroying the youth, or some kind of unfounded claim. We can get into that if you want. But I really just began to look at the future of the world, and I saw a number of exponential technology industries rising to sort of make this a reality. And so what I'm talking about is artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, blockchain, 5G, virtual reality, augmented reality, autonomous vehicles, drones. There's a wide variety of them, right? And so what I told myself is I want to be a leader in one of these fields. And I did my research. This literally happened in one night. Like I literally stayed up all one night, and I locked myself in my room, and I literally just like did all this research online. And I figured out that virtual reality and mixed reality is at this point where it's not going to go mainstream like soon, but it will go mainstream at the time where, I have built myself up and my business to be a significant player in that industry. And so, I got into VR because I realized that, one of the biggest employers in America is using it for enterprise training because it is cheaper and it is actually more effective at teaching people how to do things than having an instructor come into a class. I realized that, or I looked into rather, the United States military is using virtual reality to treat PTSD. A lot of hospitals, especially I'm up here in Boston, are using virtual reality from a variety of reasons to treat kids that have autism, to burn victims. There's this study that I read that said that virtual reality is actually more effective as a painkiller than heroin. Or excuse me, not heroin, morphine. I mean, same thing. But and it's like when you look at that, you really begin to see that virtual reality, mixed reality is this exponential technological tool that is going to fundamentally change our lives in every single sense of the way. And in my opinion, change the very definition of what it means to be a human being, to be alive, to exist.
Where do you see the best outcome in the merging between technology and being human? As in, like,
yeah, so I think
ourselves and still allowing ourselves to use technology in a way that empowers us.
Yeah, so I think that as humans, we have a very romanticized view for humans and like for kind of what's natural. If you told me that, we're going to scrap this whole technology thing, I would say that, okay, maybe, a million years ago or whatever, maybe a human being, shouldn't have picked up a stick to knock fruit out of a tree. Maybe human beings shouldn't have discovered fire, because those are really the technological inventions that really began technology. And, I really want people to understand my view of technology, because I don't really see anybody talking about it. And the way that I talk about it is this, right? Kevin Kelly, the founder of Wired magazine, he says that technology is the seventh kingdom of life, designed by evolution, and is still applicable by the same evolutionary forces as today. And so the moment that human beings discovered fire as a technology and began to cook their food, which makes food more bioavailable and burn better and more calories, that's the moment when our jaw structure started to shift. That's when our physiology began to shift. And it's like this: when you look at animals outside all day, what are they doing? They're always looking for food. They're always eating, because the food that they are eating, for the most part, is, very low calorically dense. So they have to be eating all day. That is their evolution. But human beings, that's what we also used to do. But we discovered, once we could cook our food, once we could create things like agriculture, like farming, like tools that could enable, that freed up our time, which made room for things that we look at today, like culture, religion, architecture, building cities, socializing. All these things are possible because of technology, whether you think so or not. And so what I want to challenge people to do is, we need to expand our definition of technology. Don't view technology as your iPhone. Don't view technology as, Twitter, even though that is very much technology. But it's like, you have got to understand that there is a very, very more, there's a bigger picture to this. And you got to understand that it takes a long time for, technology to get right. And, the question that you asked me, what did you say? What is the ideal
the
technology human integration?
Yeah, the optimal.
Yeah. And so this is what I think it is, man. I think nobody knows. If you ask some people genuinely think that we're going to have like some kind of purge, and like all the technology is going to revert back, and people are just going to be walking around barefoot outside and farming. I'm not a fan of that. And I'm also not a fan of the other side of that perspective of, we're going to be living in some kind of dystopian Ready Player One virtual reality world where the real world sucks and everyone just like lives in a closet and lives in virtual reality. I don't think it's going to be that either. The way that I genuinely see this unfolding is, I think human beings are just going to do the best they can in every single part of the sense. And if you actually look at what's going on, in some cases, not in every case, not with every technology is actually making us more human. And the reason why I say that's like a very bold claim, right? Wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
And the reason why I say that is this, right? So, I don't know about you, but, I look at the world, not necessarily today, but I look at the world like 100 years ago. Okay. The world 100 years ago was 1919. What was going on at that time? World War. There were wars going on. There were people dying in the streets. There were famines. There were diseases, right? And so I believe that a lot of this war happened. Obviously, I think that a lot of this war happened for conquest to gain more resources. But it's like, dude, if you actually look at a human being, like we are physiologically wired to be nice to each other. We are wired to be teammates with each other. That is just the way that we roll. Now, the way that becomes distorted is from, perverse leadership. Some kind of a person that says, hey, Dennis, you know what, man? You see those people over there? You see that group of people, whether it's, the Jews, the immigrants, whatever kind of group that has existed in history that perverse leaders and governments have used to turn people on each other. They say, hey, take a look at that group. Oh, yeah, well, the reason why you don't have a job and the reason why you don't have any food is actually because that group over there is taking your job. Or, they'll say something like, oh, you see those black people over there? You see those people over there that are living in Africa? Yeah, those are actually not human beings. God created them to be inferior. And so what actually happens is there's some kind of a leader, a group of people at the top that use, generally speaking, technology to spread information down to the majority of people to begin twisting our thoughts. This is what has happened throughout human history forever. For World War II, from thousands of years before that, that is what has always happened. But here's the thing, Dennis. If you look around today, I don't see any world wars going on, right? There are obviously still conflicts that exist. There's stuff that's going on in Syria today. There's stuff that's going on in other parts of the country. But the nature of war and the nature of human beings slaughtering each other has largely changed. There's a lot of factors when it comes to that. But I believe one of the biggest factors is large scale distributed communication information technology, right? What happens when our government starts to do something that we don't like? Everyone knows about it now on their phone. What happens when this group in our government wants to pick a war with this other country? Everybody knows about it now. And so a lot of these things are not possible today because us humans, we are able to contact with each other and we're able to understand like, oh, those people that live in Africa are not like slaves. They are human. They're a human that are just like you and I, but they just happen to be born in this area that, makes them look this way that maybe I'm not familiar with. Right. Mm-hmm. And so I think that communication technology is making us more human in that sense. Right. But there's obviously good and bad. Right. In some ways, technology has saved hundreds of millions of lives. And in other ways, it's killed a lot of people. Right. And so the question going forward is not is technology good or bad, but it is rather, how can we facilitate a good, productive conversation where we can hear everyone's opinion, everyone's side of their story in order to create the future, the technology that needs to happen tomorrow. And so that is what I'm trying to do. That's what I'm trying to do with my podcast. That's what I'm trying to do with my business. Because here's the thing, this stuff is going to happen whether we like it or not. Believe it or not, we're going to have self-driving cars. Believe it or not, there's a lot of people going to be living in virtual reality. Believe it or not, in my opinion, 100% of us are going to be living in a half real world, half mixed reality environment where instead of us using screens like phones and computers, we're going to have glasses, we're going to have contact lens, we're going to have some kind of a bionic implant that actually takes the digital world, everything that we're using screens to look at, to get access to in this virtual world, and then we're going to bring that out and integrate it into real life so you can't even tell the difference. And so that is where I believe the future is going to go. And if we're living in that kind of future, it's not about looking at technology with this doomsday outlook, but it's just seeing, what you focus on is what you get.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can focus on creating good technology, that is where our future is going to go. But if everyone is talking about how, Facebook is this, Twitter is that, and how it affects the mental health and this and that. I'm not saying these are things to disregard, but what I'm saying is we need to focus on building the future, or at least that is what I'm interested in. Everyone is different. Everyone has got, motivations and things that interest them. And it's like, that is the beauty of life. All you've got is your perspective.
I would agree that, like, I'd look at technology as a tool. It's the humans that cause the issues and cause the good stuff. It's like, but the code, do you think as more people begin to code and learn about coding, that it will help us to actually see the possibilities better and to see what technology actually is in the first place? Because sometimes I feel I only got into coding maybe 2 or 3 years ago. Up until that, the computer was like a magic box to me. I didn't understand how it operated, didn't understand any bit of coding. So as I started venturing more into that world, I began to realize what this is. Do you think that will help moving forward as more people have to learn how to code?
No, I don't think so. And the reason why I say that is if you take a look at where technology is going, I don't think anybody is going to be coding in the future. And the reason why I say that is, I think the game and how sort of like, revolutions in the world have happened is based on supply and demand. What does the world need right now, right? So when the agricultural revolution happened and people started to build the food supply in order to create new humans and create new technologies and inventions, that's when everyone in the world was a farmer, right? But then when the Industrial Revolution we started to see this transition, this phase of where people stopped being farmers and they transitioned to the cities, and people largely became factory workers. And we're seeing the same exact thing today. So, ever since the 1990s up until today, 2000, there has been a massive demand for kind of like the whole Silicon Valley development. Like, you got to learn how to code, software development. And obviously that this stuff is still applicable today. But in my opinion, and obviously nobody can predict 100% the future, but in my opinion, the way the world is going is all of these hard skills are going to be done by eventually smarter machines than us. I think there is still going to be an area where we are going to have some developers, but I think right now, and maybe like in the next 5 years, I think that is the height, the peak of the number of developers and coders that we need in this world. After that, I genuinely think developers and coders, like the same exact thing is going to happen to the other kinds of jobs, the other kinds of things. And I think it's of the utmost importance for people to actually be focusing on human skills, soft skills. What are the things that are going to make you succeed when you don't have a machine that's going to do everything? Like, I'm a fairly young guy, and I remember sitting in like my 5th grade math class and us doing math problems, and our teacher telling us, oh yeah, you can't use a calculator because, what happens when you want to do math without a calculator? Well, here's the thing. Everyone today has a calculator in their pockets, right? If you don't, you're basically crazy. And so I think it's really about kind of like having this conversation. And on another note, what I will say about this, Dennis, is this. The future changes and it moves into things that we can't even imagine. As humans, we don't even understand and comprehend the future. I genuinely think it's impossible. There are certain things that we can predict. There are certain trends and speculations that we can analyze and say. But if you take a look at the future, and especially at the past and how people understood technology and also evolutionary biology, you really understand that our brains are and were created to think on a linear path. Meaning, You take one step forward, you take another step, you're at 2 steps, 3 steps, 4 steps, 5 steps, 6 steps. That is how our brain works. But we live in a world of exponential technologies where it's no longer 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. And you see that in a lot of our institutionalized systems, right? Like the purpose of school, this happened in the Industrial Revolution, where the purpose of it is to teach people skills so then they can get out there and do whatever the factory workers or do whatever their job wanted, right? And life was great. But in the age of exponential technologies, skills become rendered obsolete roughly anywhere from 5 to 10 years. And so when that happens, where the future is going is, I don't think it's something that anybody can predict. And I don't think it's for anybody to comprehend right now. So it's like, it's cool. You and I are sitting here in 2019 and we're talking about virtual reality and this and that. But it's like, this is going to be really interesting to listen to this podcast episode in like 30 years, because it could be something totally different that our brains can't even comprehend, can't even fathom, right? Because it's all about the rate of acceleration, right? Like the amount of technological innovation, discovery, and invention that has happened in the last 5 years is doubled than what has happened in the last 10 years. And what has happened in the last 10 years has tripled what has happened in the last 20 years. Mm-hmm. And if you play that out, and especially put it out in the future, should be like life-changing inventions that are going to be discovered and invented like every half an hour. Like that is just the speed of nature in which technology moves.
Yeah. Well said. Yeah, like that's always going to confuse me. It's like we do think linearly, and the world acts more exponentially sometimes. So it's hard, even when you're starting something new as well, it's hard to comprehend, like, for example, with your podcast, how you could get to sort of stay to where you are now, like a year ago. Like, because in our minds, we can't work that out.
Yeah.
So that's
absolutely
cool.
Yeah. Can I say something else on that real quick, if we have time?
Yeah, far away.
Yeah. So, what you just said, like, the world is moving exponentially, but, our brains are moving linearly. And that's exactly right. And so I believe that the next stage of technology, and I actually know a lot of people doing this. I'm friends with this guy named Brian Johnson. He's the CEO of this company called Kernel. Okay. And it's it's like I don't know if you're aware of it, but it's like a $500 million backed accelerator that is working on augmenting human intelligence. And so, combination with mixed reality, artificial intelligence, the next step of technology is actually augmenting it in our brains so that we can actually figure out what's going on in the world, the problems that needs to be solved, and how to actually solve them, right? Because I'm seeing this trend more and more, and it's this: our brains, for what we are doing today, our brains are simply, they don't fathom the things that are going on, right? Like, we're in this really, really strange age of history where there are some people out there that are worth billions of dollars. There are some people out there that are presidents that are in charge of hundreds of millions of people. That is not something that is natural. Like this is way beyond evolution. And we need technology, in my opinion, to augment what we are doing, to improve what we are doing, whether it's our jobs, whether it's just our lifestyle, whether it's our day-to-day, whether it is our mental health. And so 100,000%, the next stage of technology is it's going to augment and embed and become a part of our biology.
Actually, as you just said that there, do you think that's the reason why a lot of people are feeling so disconnected nowadays, because we've gotten to larger and larger groups of people rather than the small individual tribes we came from?
I mean, that's really interesting, right? Like, I think if you talk to any kind of, psychologist or anthropologist, they'll tell you that, community is an essential part of what it means to be a human. But honestly, in my opinion, a lot of people talk about kind of what you just said. People are disconnected. People are unengaged. The rates of depression are up. Mental health is up. And a lot of people are saying that's social media, right? I hear that. There's not a single day that goes by where I don't hear that like 50 times. I don't know about you. And I'm not necessarily agreeing or disagreeing with that, because I think that if somebody is in a bad spot in their life, they are going to abuse anything they have access to. And we live in a world where almost everybody has a smartphone, right? And it is very, very, very easy to look at data and make assumptions and conclude things based on the numbers you see. Oh, everyone has social media. That's why the rates of depression are up. I don't know if that's right or wrong, but here's the thing that I will honestly tell you. I think the biggest reason for it is sort of along the same line of what we talked about. I genuinely believe that our evolutionary biology, our physiology itself, is disconnected to the current world. And what I mean by that is this, okay? My parents immigrated from Egypt to America, okay? If you were born in Egypt, your ancestors, your group of people, you guys have evolved through thousands and thousands of years for different aspects, different varieties, right? So there's a very well-known factor of when people immigrate from countries that are in the that are on the equator, meaning there's a lot of sun, there's a lot of heat, and they move to an area where there isn't, they get depression, because the way that their selves has formed is to get a very high percentage of vitamin D from the sun. But if you move that person and you put them in an area where there's snow, there's not a lot of sun, they're simply going to get depressed, right? And it's really interesting, right? You take a look at Northern European countries where they don't get a lot of sunlight, and they actually find that for those people, their diets actually consist of a lot of wild-caught, fatty seafood, fish. Why? Because that has a very, very large amount of vitamin D.
Okay.
And so what I'm saying is, I believe that, first off, I think a lot of us, and even if you take a look at the science, it's not really coherent. People don't really fully understand the full picture, right? Like, what I'm telling to you is not, it's a theory, right? Because it's not 100% proven, because I don't really think you can prove something 100%. The only thing that you can do is rely on your direct experience, right? So I genuinely believe that we are like this because we are going through this massive, massive era of exponential change, of where, everyone is immigrating, everyone's a migrant. And I think that's an awesome thing, but it requires a lot of change. And that kind of change is moving at a much faster rate than the slow pace of evolution that takes hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years to actually overcome. And so I genuinely think we need technology the same way that we've used technology to move to America, to invent airplanes, to create sunglasses, to create clothes. I genuinely think we need technology now to augment our brains, to augment our biology, to augment our physiology in order to do this. If I can say one more thing, if we have time.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm just on a roll. But anyway, so I interviewed this guy, Naveen Jain, right? He's a billionaire philanthropist. He started this company called Vio. And what this company has done, it has made your biology an app on your phone. So what I mean by that is this. When scientists take a look at our evolution, they see our evolution. Us humans, we're not the only part of us that is evolving. Another part of us that is evolving is, our organs, and also, this thing called a microbiome. And it is this vast ecosystem of trillions of bacteria, fungus, yeasts that is built a part of us that dictates our behavior and how we digest food and how we deal with stress. So this guy that I interviewed, his company started the world's only functional microbiome analyzing tool. And you can actually get a stool test done of your microbiome, and it'll tell you exactly what food to eat, what food not to eat, and what food to minimize. And when I took a look at my foods, a lot of the foods that, were not inherent to, where my blood and where my DNA of Egypt, of Middle East, of African, of kind of Asian descent, a lot of those foods were not good for me. Like a lot of the foods that were outside of that category. And so it's about these day-to-day things. Like this Viome thing, this is just step one. And it's like, there are startups around the world today. There are companies around the world today that are doing this every single day. It may not be perfect, but it is all a part of that evolution. Going back to technology is the seventh kingdom of life, subject to the same evolutionary forces as every other evolutionary kingdom there is today. So that this stuff takes time, but it's moving very fast, and it's like, I'm trying to get on top of it,
It's very interesting, man. I could talk about this all day, but yeah, better call it a day. But where can these guys find you online, and what's the best way to connect with you?
Yeah, so you can just Google me. My name is Mark Metry, MarkMetry. Check out my podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts, and definitely reach out.
Great. Cool. Thanks, Mark. Thanks for taking your time today and talking about technology, mindset, and your own journey so far to date. So best of luck with everything in the future and in 2019. And thanks again for sharing your thoughts.
Absolutely, Dennis. You're the best, man.
Cool. So until next time, have fun and enjoy the process.